Good evening to everybody. Um, so thank you everyone for joining our first of our winter webinar series. So introductions, I'm Phil Woolery. I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Forestry and Woodland Owners Association. Just a little bit about our organization if you don't know. Um, our mission is to promote good forest practices and stewardship of the land and inform the general public about forestry issues and benefits of good forest management. So tonight we are excited to have you join us, and we're going to hear from Kurt Lanzone. Kurt is a Purdue University Extension agricultural and natural resources educator in Parke County. He's also a longtime maple tree tapper, and he continues this tradition with his family on their own woods. And he's been part of a Purdue University Extension team that worked on a maple syrup grant to improve marketing and production of maple syrup in Indiana. So I will hand it over to Kurt, and I believe he will you can put questions in the chat, or you can put them. We'll save them for the end, and we'll get to them there. So I'll hand it over to Kurt and mute myself.
All right. Thanks for joining us tonight. I appreciate the introduction, Phil. Phil was also a member of that team. We had a great time doing that project, and there's a second phase of it that's occurring right now. So we're pretty excited to have that going on. One of the things, that I've always been involved with some form of sugaring or tapping maple trees in our family's woodlot. Trying to pass it down to the next generation. So you can see my son here where he was there with me. They enjoy it. It's something to do, something to get out. And that's what we're going to go over is reasons why people do this, if they're not looking at the production phase. So one thing we talk about is recreational purposes. We get out of the cold winter weather and we start to move on doing some outdoor activity, gets us productive outside. A lot of people like to do it because they can control product quality. If you're looking for a certain grade of syrup, if you're looking for a certain color for that flavor profile, you can control that as well. There's some families in Indiana that will only tap the first couple runs because they only like that light amber coloring, which has a certain flavor profile. Another reason why we do it because it gets the whole family involved. It's all of us working together, having good quality family time, using stuff in our woodlot, and carrying on family tradition that's gone on for generations here in our woodlot. So the other thing we talk about is health benefits. If you're backyard sugaring, you're probably not running on tubing or vacuum system, so you're getting lots of exercise, hauling sap, taking care of that, keeping good quality there, moving it back to the sugar house. The other thing is there's a lot of talk with the grant work that we did of the health benefits of using maple syrup as a sweetener itself compared to other sweeteners that are out there. Go through, I've got some videos, and Lenny Farley, many of you might be familiar with him. He's done a series on tree identification, and he does it so well with having all the examples there. It's hard for me to do it on a video and have all the examples in front of me and be able to hold them up. So I've asked him to borrow these videos that he's given us, and we'll talk through after I play the video about why we look for that particular tree and stuff when we're tapping trees. So here's Lenny.
Today we're going to give you some identification characteristics for one of our more common Indiana tree species, sugar maple. Sugar maple has good shade tolerance, meaning it can regenerate in the shade of other or its own species that overtop it. That allows it to be a common regenerating species in the understory of our older forests. So it's becoming more common all the time. Sugar maple, like most of the maples, has opposite leaf arrangement, meaning the leaves originate directly opposite each other on the twigs. It has a simple leaf on a relatively long leaf stem, and the leaves are lobed and normally 5 lobed, 2 smaller lobes at the base and then 3 larger lobes at the top. Sugar maple twigs, as they mature, develop a medium brown color, and the buds are about the same color as the twigs. Sugar maple is famous for producing maple syrup, so it often takes about 40 gallons or more of maple sap to make a gallon of maple syrup in the boiling process. And we can get maple syrup from almost any maple tree, but the yield of sugar maple is one of the highest. The bark on sugar maple is very variable. Typically, it does have a light to medium gray color. It can have some ridging, like this older specimen here that's about 16 inches in diameter. But we can also have relatively smooth bark on seedlings and saplings, and some bark that has crevicing and minor ridges on medium-sized trees. And I have even run into some trees that had bark that were similar to oak and other species. So bark can be somewhat confusing on sugar maple, but be sure to look for that opposite leaf and branch characteristics on the tree, and very deep shade with that large 5-lobed leaf, and that'll help you identify sugar maple.
So as Lenny said, one of the things that we face trouble-wise is the bark can be very irregular. It'll have in general, that same gray cast color to it, but the texture of it will be very variable. So for new people that are coming into this, one thing I suggest to have is a good spotting scope or a pair of binoculars. That way you can actually see up into the branching right now, because right now we have buds that are starting to emerge, and you can see that opposite leaf arrangement starting to come out on the stems and as well as the branching. There's very few trees in the woods that have that opposite branching, so that makes one way that's easier to distinguish those. Sugar maple is one of our favorites to tap. Just like he said, the sugar content is very high on these. We'll talk more about sugar content in a little bit. But sugar maple is one of our more prolific producers of sugar content.
Today we're going to give you some identification characteristics for one of our more common Indiana tree species, sugar maple. Sugar maple has good shape. Today we're going to look at a common but oftentimes not correctly identified tree native here in Indiana. Now, some of you are going to be looking at this and saying, yeah, it's common and we know what it is. This is sugar maple. Well, this is actually black maple. Black maple looks an awfully lot like sugar maple, but there are a couple of different characteristics that will help us identify this tree from its close cousin, sugar maple. First off, black maple will have a tendency to have these little stipules. It's like a little miniature leaf at the base of the large leaves. This is a common characteristic that's held on oftentimes through the summer. And so look at the base of that leaf stem, and if you find that little stipule there, there's a good chance you're looking at black maple, not sugar maple. In sugar maple, these are absent. One of the other characteristics for black maple are mottled gray stems with dark buds. The stems on sugar maple have a tendency to be a medium to dark brown with dark brown buds as well. The bark on black maple is very similar to sugar maple, and we get a lot of variation in these bark patterns, but it's typically a lighter gray color and maybe relatively smooth like this in young trees with flakes or plates in older trees. One of the characteristics of black maple that shows up later in the growing season are large dark leaves that have a tendency to droop at the edges. And so as this tree matures through the summer, we'll typically see a darkening of the leaves, and these broad leaves will have a tendency to droop down at the edges as well. So using the characteristics of the stipules, that mottled gray stem color, and the dark buds, and the dark leaves that droop at the edges, maybe you can impress some of your friends by differentiating between sugar maple and black maple.
So right now, during this time of season, when we're out in the wood lot, it's very difficult to look for stipules, right? They're not there. as we don't have leaves emerging yet. So we really have to look for that stem color and the bud. The good news is black maples are very similar in sugar content to sugar maples. It's just slightly less, which still a great tree to tap because being in the hard maple family, they do produce really good, high quality sap with better than what I would say average sugar content. So in our woodlot, we tap hard maples. So sugar and blacks, they both are the ones that we're looking for. We'll go through some of the others here. Surely everybody recognizes this one.
Today, we're going to give you some identification characteristics for silver maple. We have several species of maple native in Indiana, and in some cases, they can be a little bit confusing in terms of identities of which species is which. Silver maple is one of our soft maples, meaning that it sheds its seed relatively early in the season. And so it, along with red maple, will be one of the first species to put flowers out in the spring and will mature its wing seed sometime typically in mid to late May. Our hard maples will typically flower later in the growing season, and their seed matures in the fall. Silver maple is a tree that is most commonly found in floodplain or other moist to wet areas, although it will grow in a variety of locations and is one of our faster growing trees here in Indiana. As with almost all the maples, it has opposite leaf arrangement. And so the leaves are held directly opposite each other on the twigs. It has relatively long leaf stems and simple leaves. And in the case of silver maple, the leaves are typically 5-lobed and have very deep divisions called sinuses between the lobes. If we flip this leaf over, we can see where it gets its name. It has a very silvery green underside color, which is really prominent when the wind's blowing. These trees will turn almost completely silver as those leaves turn over in the wind. The tree typically, as a young tree, has relatively smooth gray bark that's similar to many of the other maples. As an older tree, the bark will typically be a little bit darker and divided into large, rough, flaky plates. Silver maple has historically been used for street trees in many cases. However, it may not be always the best choice for that, in that it tends to have weaker wood and does grow very quickly and gets to be a very large tree. One of the great characteristics for identifying this particular maple from the others is the very deeply divided lobed leaves and the fact that it is a soft maple producing its seed early in the spring, and it has a very large winged seed. We can make maple syrup from the sap of silver maple. However, it oftentimes does not produce nearly as much sugar per gallon of sap as sugar maple does.
So one of the keys in identifying it when there's no leaves on it is the platy, flaky bark. In general, it'll peel off real easily, similarly to shagbark hickories, and you can just flake it right off. We do not tap these in our woodlot. We do have some. One problem that you have is they do have higher sugar content or lower sugar content than the hard maples, but they also will bud out quicker. As he said, the seed sets come a lot sooner, and if we don't watch it and are careful with it, we can have some sap that we collect that could be what they call buddy sap, and it'll have an off taste to it once you boil it down. When you're just sampling it from the bag to check for freshness, you can't really taste it until it starts to boil down because the sugar content is so low in the silvers that you can't really detect it with any instruments or your tongue.
Today we're going to give you some identification characteristics for one of our Indiana maples, red maple. Red maple is a very popular selection for ornamental plantings in yards and for street trees, but it also is native to our Indiana woodlands, and we typically find it growing both on moist and also dry sites. It is a well-named species in that oftentimes in the fall, the foliage has a very beautiful red to maroon color, and in the spring, the flowers that come out very early in the spring will typically be a reddish color, as will sometimes the early developing winged fruit. This is a soft maple, meaning it does produce its fruit and seeds very early in the summer, and is one of the first plants in terms of our native trees to flower in the spring. Our hard maples will have a tendency to flower later in the season, and their fruit ripens in the fall. Red maple has 3 to 5 lobed leaves with relatively shallow divisions between the lobes, or also called sinuses, and they are prominently V-shaped. This leaf can look a little bit like sugar maple, but the V shape on the sinuses differentiates it from the U shape that we find on sugar maple. As in all the maples, the leaf arrangement on red maple is opposite, with relatively long leaf stems. The bark on young trees is gray and smooth, as is typical for many of the maples. On older trees, it may get a more of a flaky appearance. And we can find this tree both in bottomlands, but also in upland sites where it can be an understory tree in a variety of different hardwood forests. It is a popular tree for shade and ornamental purposes in the fact that it does have great fall color, and it can be used for producing maple syrup. However, the sugar yield per gallon of sap oftentimes is not as high as what we've got with sugar maple.
And the same thing goes there with the silver maple. The early budding can affect quality of the product that we're trying to produce. And then also the sugar percentage is low too. So it takes a lot more gallons to make the same amount with some of the hard maples.
On this edition of ID That Tree, we're going to introduce you to an Indiana maple species that may not suggest maple to you when you see the leaves, and that is box elder. And in fact, even the name suggests some folks decided maybe it didn't really belong in the maple group, but in fact, it is a member of our maple family here in Indiana. Box elder has opposite leaf arrangement, just like all of our other native Indiana maples. What sets it apart are these compound leaves, and so box elder typically has 3 to 5 leaflets. And in fact, the 3 leaflet leaves can make a little bit of a suggestion of poison ivy. But remember, poison ivy has alternate leaf arrangement and is a vine typically. Box elder, tree size, opposite leaf arrangement. Another good identification characteristic for box elder are these green twigs. And so this can be a bright kind of Kelly green or more of an olive green in color, but very typical for the species and not found on any of other native Indiana maples. Box elder bark, as you can see, is kind of a medium gray in color, long running, relatively flattened ridges up and down. And this species is actually in flower right now. As you can see, not a particularly showy flower, long strands holding the pollen, relatively green to yellow-green in color, and could even be missed if we're not looking closely. And that's oftentimes the case with many of our hardwood species. It may not have showy flowers, but they're flowering nonetheless to produce that fruit that reproduces the species. And as in the maples, this will ultimately produce a paired wing seed that we recognize floating across the landscape to reseed our maples. So box elder, fairly common denizen of some of our bottomland forest areas and wet and moist sites, and one of our native Indiana maples, but the only one with compound leaves.
And the box elder is very much a solid option for tapping. The sugar contents in it range in the 1% range, so they are slightly higher than the silver and the reds. It does not flower as soon as the silver and the reds, so a great option if you have some of those in your woodlot. So there's a lot of other tree possibilities too here in Indiana. We know of several people here that have produced syrup or sugary products from other trees. Black walnut is very popular. Pricing for it in the retail area can be up to $300 plus a gallon. The reason why is because it takes quite a bit of black walnut sap to produce. You're running on a sugar content with it where it's less than 1%. The issue with it is finding someone that wants to drill a high dollar tree in their woodlot to make syrup from. Hickory family, there's several of those species that we can tap. Sycamore is a well-known one. It does not yield a whole lot of sap. The sugar content for it's around 1%. Birch trees, not real popular in Indiana, but as we get further north, they do have some popularity up there. And then there's a lot of other lesser known trees that are tapped. Ironwood actually is tapped. One that we don't tap is cherry. The sap on it is toxic. We don't want to mess around with it. But there is several species. If you have questions about that, be sure to reach out. There's a lot of options there. So what makes the sap flow? Everybody talks about, spring coming, and it's just one of those things where it's Mother Nature waking up the tree and starting to move, through osmotic process to get that sugar out. And kind of, but not. One thing we do know is as the trees have thawed out this spring and other springs, the root system doesn't necessarily have to be thawed out to make this happen. Depending on the size of the tree, if it has a sizable trunk, there's probably already some sucrose in it. Where as that warming happens, that's when we get that pressure increase inside that helps push that sap towards the roots. And as it's doing that, we're getting that pressure through the hole that we've made where it forces that out to that. The other thing is if we have a commercial producer, they have a vacuum system where they're actually putting negative pressure on that hole through the spile. And that negative pressure that they put in there actually helps suck more sap out of the tree than what would naturally flow out. With Mother Nature, and when we're taking it gravity, dripping into a bucket or a bag, things of that nature, it's going to give up essentially what it has that's excess. And if it doesn't have excess, it's not going to produce any. There could be other reasons why a hole is not productive, and that could be we're in an area of bad wood where there's rot there, or there could be sap sucker that had tapped or put a hole in that area, and that wood there is not viable for having more sap flow. So there's a lot of options that keep it from producing sap. This year, our trees have been below average, I would say. We're in the drought area still. We were in the drought area quite lengthy time last summer and fall when the tree is trying to put away some sugars and store those. And I think that I've read some studies out of Vermont where that can affect how much is available for the next season. We don't have a lot of data on that from Purdue, but University of Vermont has done quite a bit of work on maple production. One thing that always comes up every spring, did I tap too early? Did I tap too late? There's a lot of studies that have been done up in the Northeast and the New England states, different tapping times and how much yield has come from the trees themselves. In general, in Indiana, we can tap after mid-January, depending on swings in temperature. We want the freeze and thaws to occur because that's what's going to help us gain the advantage of getting the sucrose out of the tree. However, we can tap too late too, because if those trees do start to turn over and go buddy, then we can't use that sugar water anymore for production. And then you can see that in this study, the ones that were tapped later in the season, they had to pull the taps because that buddiness. The other thing is, if you tap early, the hole's basically going to stay good for about 6 weeks. And when we have that hole that's good for 6 weeks, you can time out how long your season's going to be. So in general, the way the weather change has happened with our climate, we're done by the first, second week in March anyway in central Indiana. So if I know that I've got until, mid-March to harvest sugar water off trees, I know that I'm good to tap anytime towards the end of January. Playing it safe that way. The key thing is to look at the weather forecast, see when you think you can make runs. Typically in Indiana, in central Indiana here where we're at, we get 6 runs that are good for us to produce from. And those 6 runs is what we plan our schedules around, trying to make those happen. But 6 weeks in general until the tree starts to heal itself, and then won't let any more sugar water go through those. So we talk about some equipment for tapping. We got to have a drill of some sort. You can go from hand drills like old times all the way up to fancy cordless drills, lithium-ion batteries that have depth gauges on them. There's a wide variety of what they have. There's some that are gas powered that run off of a weed eater head, essentially, that you can take out to the woodlot with you. One thing I will stress, it's important to pick the right size bit. We can go from 3/16 spiles all the way up to 7/16 spiles. 3/16, 5/16, and 7/16 are the common ones. I have tapped with all 3. 7/16 leaves a pretty good size hole that the tree has to heal back. One thing about it, 3 years from now, you're going to still be able to see where that original hole was that you drilled 3 years ago, so you avoid it from tapping over. 3/16 hole, the next year you might have to struggle to find it. It can be like what some of the sapsuckers use when they're putting their holes in. They can be harder to locate. You have to look a little bit harder for them. You also have to have some kind of striking device to tap the spile or spout in. As you start to tap it in, you will hear the change in sound on the spile, and it'll have more of a thud sound to it, and that means it's seeded. So we talk about different spiles and spouts. We can use tubing, bags, buckets. I have switched all over to bags at our place here just for the simple fact that they are economical. If I have one that gets torn down by a storm or a critter, we have plenty of squirrels that like to sample some of the sugar water. I can replace that fairly cheaply. If you're running tubing down to buckets or running tubing on vacuum, it can be a lot more, I'll say, harder to find sometimes if they do chew a hole in one of the pieces of tubing on a vacuum system, because you got to isolate where that leak is, and you have to fix all those before you can start getting successful with your vacuum collection of your sugar water. Buckets, they've been around forever. Now most of them are plastic. They've gotten away from galvanized buckets just because of the fact of the possible contamination. Plastic's easier to clean, real readily available. Those are all over the internet. You can find those. The other thing that's really cool that we started with is the blue bag there that you see in my hand, and those are a hanger style where they have a ring that goes inside of it, and it clamps down with the bag in between, and then you slide the hanger on there. It protects water from getting in there, and it's real easy to pick up and dump. The only downfall of those that I do not like for us was the fact that I had to drill 7/16 holes for all of those, and I'm not a fan of drilling the 7/16 holes in the trees. Lots of options though. Anything from metal spiles and spouts to plastic. Plastic seems to be a lot more common nowadays because of the economics of it. You can see the 5/16 on the right. You can get a spout or a spile for 28 cents. So if something happens to one, it's easy to replace. Where if you're using an aluminum one and you're tapping it in and you have something happen with the angle of your hammer and you hit it the wrong way and it's cold out, sometimes those can break. and then you have to replace that. And it's a lot harder to replace a $2 spout or spile than it is a 28-cent one. So there's plenty of places on the internet. If you're interested in finding some of those, just do a search for maple spout or spile, and there'll be all kinds of options that show up. Talked a little bit earlier about the collection options. On our farm, we use the ones on the left now, that bag, and it's basically a dairy bag. It's brand new. Hasn't been had anything in it product wise. Comes on the tree and fits over one of those black plastic spiles real easily. The other thing I like about those, I can collect a full bag, and they come in various sizes, but they have caps with them. And just like when you're taking a dairy product to the ice cream shop to put in their machine, we can do the same thing with this. I can fill up my side by side with all these bags and put the caps on them and take them to the sugar house, and don't even have to transfer into another container. So it's a really good option for that because it's kind of the container to go theory. My son there has the blue bag with the hangers that I was talking about earlier. And then a real popular option with people is using some kind of water jug. You know, we want something that's food grade. And then we run some tubing into it and tap that way. A lot of people like those. It's real easy to see how much you have out there. And if you have a couple of them, you can just switch those out and take that back to the sugar house with you, or your location where your evaporator is. Tapping guidelines. Minimum of 10 inches. You can see me here showing with a tape measure. That's a good way for us to get a rough idea of the diameter of a maple tree. If we want to get particular about it, we can get out a Doyle stick and measure it using it. 10 inches, one spile or spout, 18 to 24 inches, two spouts or spiles, and then 25 inches and up, we do three. You'll see some producers that will do more than three if they're really large maple trees. I don't like to do that because we have a lot of surface area on very large maples, and that makes them very prone to disease and insect pressure due to the surface area and the size. So there's all kinds of openings where they're fighting Mother Nature anyway. And I try to keep those trees intact in our woodlots, so I try to do everything I can to protect them. Tapping depth and angle. All of our stuff is on gravity, so we're going through bags. No vacuum lines. So we try to put just like a very slight angle on that just to help it flow a little bit. We don't want to have a negative angle to where it has to actually go up and out to get out of the spout. So we just try to put a little bit. If we put too much angle on it, we found that it's harder to get those bags on. So we're pretty flat, just slight angle when we put that in. When we drill those trees, we want a sharp bit, and we try to do it in one solid motion. That way we make sure we get all the wood shavings out. One thing that we look at, 1.5 to 2 inches is our depth range. And there's some different options we can do to try and make sure that we don't go any deeper than that. One of the things that I do is I put a piece of plastic tubing over my drill bit and cut it to the right length. That way it's a stopper, so I don't drill too deep. Really comes in handy when the kids are helping, because then we make sure that we don't have somebody trying to judge what, 1.5 to 2 inches is versus what they actually drill. Equipment for collection. I talked about some of the stuff that we do on our place with using the bags that are off the trees because of their cost. The other option is we can go buy a whole bunch of 5-gallon buckets. Most of the buckets produced now are food grade. They've got a sticker on them where they're proudly stating that. You can pick them up all kinds of box stores. The other thing is we do have larger containers if you're collecting a lot, where you can have these food grade cage reinforced containers. Just make sure if you're sourcing one from another product's already been in it, make sure that it is well cleaned out. We don't want no residue in it because residue can come out in the sugar water and you might not detect it until you start to get down to your finished product because it might not evaporate like what the water is out of the sugar water and it may be with the sugar itself. So it could be in your sugar solution. Keeping sap fresh with this weather that we've had that just went through, the big warm spike, it's always a problem for producers to keep sap fresh. Um, I had to boil a batch that I typically wouldn't boil last night because I didn't want to have any problems with it spoiling. We want to try and keep that bacteria and yeast growth to a minimum. And if we can keep that bacteria and yeast growth to a minimum, we get a better product. Smaller quantities, you can boil off some of it to reduce it and then cool it and put it in the freezer. We can store it in the refrigerator. There will be people that take milk jugs and freeze them with ice in it, or put water in them and freeze them and make ice, and they'll toss those into their bigger containers, trying to keep the sap cool. One of the biggest things that I can tell you from my perspective, if I collect in the morning before I go to work when it's the coolest time during the 24-hour period, and I put that into a larger container, that cooler sap being more of it, it is harder to change the temperature in that larger container than if I had went through and collected all that sap at the end of the day when it's its warmest. Because then it'll hold that heat overnight in that larger container. So emptying stuff in the morning seems to work a lot better as trying to keep stuff cooler. A lot of people say treat it like milk. It's not quite as sensitive as milk, but it can have that bacteria and yeast growth. And we'll talk about why that's important here in a little bit. But trying to keep it as fresh as possible is one of the most important things. We don't let anything sit around here, even in ideal conditions, for more than 3 or 4 days. Jones rule of 86. So if you have a hydrometer that's a sap hydrometer and you can see what your percent sugar content is in the sap you are collecting, it will give you a quick idea of how many gallons of sap you need to make a gallon of syrup. And we talk about sugar maples and black maples in being the 2% is our ideal range. And when we look at making a batch of syrup, we know that if it's in that 2% range, it's essentially going to take 43 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup. Now, the one thing that does not take into account is if you lose product on various surfaces of the pan, if we're doing filtering. There's a lot of different ways that you can actually lose some sugar, but that's a general guideline is it's 43 gallons. Depending on how much storage the plant or the tree has done, it can also affect our how much sugar content we have in our trees. This year, ours are running a little bit higher or a little bit lower than 2%. The last batch that I did calculated out to about 52 gallons of sap per gallon of syrup. So not quite in that ideal range that we want, but early in the season, we have less sugar content. And as we go through the season, we'll get the main run, and that will have higher sugar content. And then as we get towards the end, it'll have less sugar content as well. So it'll work up, we hope, to having better sugar content and be more in that 2% range. A lot of producers that are doing this for backyard and hobby sized are finding the benefits of using reverse osmosis. A lot of people doing this in their yards or backwood lots or a few trees, they're getting this and it will cut down their boiling time well over half. As you run it through a reverse osmosis system, it basically removes half the water each time that it goes through the system. And you can run it multiple times to get a more concentrated sugar solution to boil. We use this now on our place. I run it through once because I still want good time to caramelize sugars to give good flavors to it. If somebody's using where they're running the reverse osmosis way up on sugar content, you can tell to me by taste because it still doesn't have the same development of those tannins that are in the sugar water to make that extra flavor pop in your tongue. But it's a good product that helps us use less firewood. And there's a lot of home producers that are using propane or other fuel sources that are not wood. And that can be quite costly if they're doing that. So this is a good way to help offset that propane cost or liquid fuel. Talk about evaporator sizing. We'll go through some options of evaporators. Here's some guidelines though from New Hampshire. One thing that they talk about is sizing an evaporator in gallons per hour for your size of or the amount of taps you have. I can tell you that I have a 2x4 pan that I use, and I have to really push hard to get 15 gallons per hour. Now with having the reverse osmosis system into it, I've cut my boiling time in half, so I'm a lot more efficient in what I'm producing. Evaporator spacing, evaporator size, and having that space in there will help make a big difference, but it's also more costly to buy a larger pan as well. So if you have plenty of time and plenty of fuel for whatever you're doing, buy a bigger pan, run more sap. Here's some different examples of what some setups can be, and it can be simple as some cinder blocks. I do recommend that you line the inside of that with fire bricks. You can see some propane here and just a stock pot on the left. Down the bottom, you can see a very large, more commercial evaporator that's wood fired. And then on the right is a large pan that's a wood fired too, made out of an old oil boiler. One of the things that you can see, the one on the oil boiler pan, it has a pre-warming pan, so the person can put sap up in there and it will pre-warm it. That way, when it starts to dribble into the pan, it doesn't kill all the boil, because one of the keys is to keep your boil going. If you keep your boil going very efficiently and steadily, that's going to get you a higher evaporation rate to get that water off of the products. Temperature of the boiling water, 212 degrees. Finished temperature for our syrup is 7.5 degrees above that. Some vary in different areas based on altitude, but this is your standard, what we recommend in Indiana. Digital thermometers are fairly cheap now on the high end, compared to some of the old glass candy ones that can be very hard to read, as they seem to steam up and get sugar on them. As you start to have evaporation, you'll have a real fine mist of sugar that'll build up on it. One thing that we want to do is try and make sure that we get an accurate reading for that as we try to finish syrup, because this is one of our first ways to tell when we get towards the end of the syrup process and have that solution with as much sugar in it before it becomes crystals. Some words of advice: keep the heat high. Wood choices: when we use wood in ours, we're picking black locust or Osage orange for ours. That's some of the highest BTU output that you can get out of the wood lot. So that's what we're using to try and keep that up. Thing to remember: don't stir the sap. That will help increase more foam. It's okay to use a defoamer, uh, organic based oil from the store, like a cooking oil, will help keep that. And just try to keep adding sap as it evaporates off. Try to keep that pan level the same throughout the time that it's going through the process. And that that ranges inch and a half depth. As we get towards the end of the boil, if we didn't have much sap collected, that number of depth gets lower. So that's one thing we have to look at. The ultimate way to check and make sure when you're finishing a batch is by using a hydrometer. And there's a lot of variations in hydrometers available. My words of advice, get one that is certified. I've got one that's here approved by Vermont Department of Agriculture. As you can see on here, we've got two different lines on it. When we talk about having syrup that's done and legal to sell in Vermont, it has to be above 66 bricks, and that's the percent sugar in there. Now, you notice that it says cold test, so basically room temperature, we want that at that bricks level there on the left. If we're boiling it though, and we want to know when to pull it off, we need to have the option of where we can look at it when it's hot. So one way we can do that is we can have a cup. They call it a hydrometer cup. It's made out of stainless steel usually, and you ladle in a little bit of almost finished syrup into it and let that hydrometer float in there and let it cool just ever so slightly, because it's going to be around 218, 219 degrees. So you let it cool just a little bit, and that's when you're reading for that. And we're looking for that 59 range on that, because when syrup is warmer, it is less viscous and will not float the hydrometer as high. So when we're finishing the syrup, what we shoot for at our place, we try to pull it off the wood about 217, 218 degrees, and that'll be in that 64 bricks range. And then we'll put it on what we call a finishing pan, and I can control it with propane then and try to finish it to get to that syrup content that we want that is safe. Before all this equipment with thermometers and hydrometers, producers would use what they call a sheeting method. If you take it and dip a spoon in the syrup solution itself and you hold it up, and as you start to hold it up and it starts to drip off, it'll start to sheet off. And when it starts to sheet off instead of drip off, that was when they would call it produced syrup. Filtering syrup. At home, we can come up with a really high quality product with some cheap filters that are available in a lot of different places. It doesn't take too much. One thing I tell you is you want to make sure that the filter is slightly damp to start with. That way it works better. If it's dry, that can help prevent the product from flowing through it altogether. It will gum up and sit on it, and it will not flow through. You can also use what they call a settling method. If you're doing small batches where you're just putting stuff in a quart jar, you can let that settle in the refrigerator or on the counter if you actually canned it there in a jar, and all the sugar sand or niter byproduct will settle out in the bottom, and then you can pour off the good syrup off the top, and that's a very common method. When we start talking about commercial operation presses, filter presses, those we'll use diatomaceous earth, and you mix that in with your syrup solution, and then it's going to go through and help bind with the niter, and it can be a very costly process. The other thing is it can cost you quite a bit of syrup, and if you're not producing, lots of gallons of syrup, it's kind of a waste. Packing syrup. When we pack syrup at home, we need to make sure it's at least at 180 degrees when we put it into the container. Make sure it's a sterile jar and a sterile lid. Do not go over 200 degrees if you're reheating to repack, because that's when sugar sand can develop again. One thing to note, plastic containers do not keep product as long. Glass containers are one of the favorites. The other thing is you have to keep them out of the sunlight because that can degrade it as well. We want to make sure we have a good product that's here, for a while. But if you're like our house, we don't have any around very long, so I don't have to worry about hardly having any for the next year. So that's that. After you open a jar or a bottle, make sure you put it in the refrigerator. When you're trying to select what you're going to keep it in, make sure you can have extra if you have a good season. That way you can run to the store and get whatever you need. Around here, we don't have a lot of supply houses for maple syrup stuff. So, a lot of the options around here is to put stuff in mason jars, to give away as gifts, as Christmas presents and things of that nature. Grading of syrup. This has been out for quite a while now. This is what they've switched to. The golden color and delicate flavor is the one on the left, and it has a real light, almost corn syrupy flavor to it. It just doesn't have a lot of palatable flavor like maple. And as you go through the group there and go to the right, you'll get to the dark robust and strong flavors, and those will have more of a deep coffee rich flavor to them. And a lot of people talk about, well, how does all this happen? Well, initially in the early season, basically we start on the left side of this and then we work to the right throughout the season. And one of the big things that is making this happen is the bacteria and the yeast that are in Mother Nature. They actually feed on the sucrose that we're trying to take from the tree, and they will convert it to glucose and fructose. And those, especially fructose, has a lower caramelization point. And as we're boiling it to get our required sugar content of bricks, it'll actually develop that caramelization, and that's how that comes about. The other thing is, typically as we get more later in the season, there's even less sugar available from the tree, and so we have to boil longer as well. You can roast, if you have a golden color or an amber color on the left side and say you want that very dark, strong flavor, you can actually just roast roll, heat simmer some of that on the left side. And as you start to warm that up and get it to a slight simmer, that will actually caramelize those. It just takes a long process because you want to try to keep from evaporating a whole lot of it, because that will make it crystallize. And next thing you know, you'll have sugar. Talk about safety real quick, because I think this is an important part. A lot of people will forget this. Having proper clothing out there, we're going to go through a whole swing of temperature changes while we're in the sugar bush or in the sugar shack. So make sure that you have a proper of clothing, using safety glasses, safety gloves, having good boots to work in the environment, because it can be anything from snowy and slick, slushy mess to muddy mess. To yesterday evening when I collected, it was very dry in our woodlot and the leaves were slick. So it can be very dangerous things. So remember using high temperature thing to evaporate off and make this process happen. Use really good safety precautions when you're working with that high heat. Have your extinguisher there. Good idea to have a couple extinguishers. That way, if you do have a fire that gets away, you can put it out. Maybe having a water source there, because if you do use what they call an ABC extinguisher and you shoot that on there, all that powder comes out and you've ruined everything you've worked so hard at accomplishing. So we'll go through a checklist real quick. We want to make sure we have healthy maple trees, something to collect with. We got to have a spout or a spile. We got to have a way to put the spout or spile in. Got to have some kind of storage containers. We need at a minimum a thermometer to do it safely. Hydrometer is definitely the best. Got to have some evaporation equipment to get rid of the water. Maybe a reverse osmosis system. We got to have fuel selection for the evaporator. Got to have large jars or filters to reduce that sugar sand, and then our safety equipment that we talked about. Talk real briefly about home-based vendor rules. State of Indiana classifies maple syrup as a home-based vendor product. It is considered safe because it is the high sugar content makes it very hard for it to have bacteria in the finished product. So it's considered very safe. Make sure that you do not sell it to somebody for them to resell. You can sell it at farmers markets, roadside stands. You can sell it on the internet. You can ship it to somebody. That's the new rules right now. One thing you do have to be is you do have to be serve safe, food safe certified. So producing that, and you have to have the label on it that says that it's a home-based vendor, 10-point font. If you need to know the wording exactly for that, you can contact the extension offices. We can help you that. We can also show you where the classes are to get food safe certified, if that interests you. And of course, we are more than happy to help everybody. We do not discriminate against anyone. So if you call us, we will help you. Questions. I got some extra time, so I know I got a few minutes left.
Yep. Thanks, Kurt. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat here, and I'll field them to Kurt. So we have one. It's how many trees do you tap?
We're at 100 on our woodlot, and then I have a friend that has closer to town where they have some black walnuts that they're never going to harvest because they're in town. And so we tap 12 black walnuts as well and produce black walnut syrup from.
All right. I have a question if you can answer this. So in your talk you mentioned the filtering and sugar sand. So what is sugar sand?
So sugar sand is a combination of the byproduct that's getting released as it evaporates off, mostly made from magnesium and calcium, and it looks like sand literally. That's why it's called sugar sand. It's technically called niter, but as that precipitates out and you filter it, it'll get caught in your filter, or if you settle it out, it'll settle in the bottom because it's heavier. But it looks just like beach sand in the bottom, and it has that same, texture. And if you put that in your mouth, you're going to know that it is nothing sweet. It is not very good. Has really no true flavor that's even appealing to someone.
All right. Here's a question. What are your thoughts on using a refractor to measure bricks?
They work really well as long as you keep it calibrated. It's no different than any of the hydrometers that we use. We need to have those checked pretty regular. That way we can make sure they're in tune. One thing I will say, the refractometers can be fairly expensive for an accurate one. So that's one thing we got to look at as well. I will tell you, when they're judging syrup for contests, for like national contests and stuff like that, that's what they're using to check it.
Yep. So here's
anybody thinking about doing this themselves, or any other producers in here?
I think we got at least one. Kirk, he sounds like one on there. I think I talked to him earlier today, so he's a producer. But I just like to say that the worst maple syrup that I've ever had has come from Vermont. So
that's right. I have some friends that have family in Vermont, and they have requested Indiana syrup as gifts because the more depth of flavor profile from the Indiana syrup. I'm just going to throw that out there. That's all opinions, but
So yeah, my bad syrup that I had from Vermont was part of a program that we did with Vermont, and they sent us syrup and we're training for quality, and part of it was the bad syrup. So they purposely sent us bad syrup. The buddy syrup, I know from experience, is very, very bad.
Yeah, it's not even fit to boil down more to make sugar out of.
No.
And that's the hard part about any of that. You boil it down and you don't know it's bad until you get to like the final stages when it's really starting to condense. Because that's when those, I don't know if it's the tannins or what that actually make it. I would like to learn more about it to figure out how it actually happens because I would be more apt to tap some silvers or reds in our woods, but we have enough anyway. I don't know why I'm saying that.
You can always make more syrup.
Ken says he's considering it. The biggest thing I can say is figure out how you're going to evaporate it. There's so many videos available now and resources to figure out what's going to fit best for you. Just looking at all those options, one of the best ideas.
Yep.
My wife's family, when they used to do it when she was a kid up here at our woodlot now, they would boil in a cast iron kettle. It was the same one that they would use for, their bean cooks and stuff like that in the summer. It was the do all for everything over the open fire. And so they would reduce, and I mean, it was a family party all weekend. So we don't do that anymore. We're a little bit more up to date. What types of non-maple syrup have you tasted and which is your favorite? So walnut, we've made it. It has more of a nutty flavor to it. I've had sycamore before and it has more of a like buttery butterscotch flavor to it. Um, it's real light. I have not done hickory or I'm really curious about the ironwood. We don't have many ironwoods left in our wood lot. I've kind of eradicated those. They're kind of a pesky booger, so I've girdled plenty of those and gotten rid of them. So I don't think I'll be tapping any of those.
I've
If you
I've
get a chance to try the walnut, though, try it. Some places you'll find that have smaller, um, what we call nip bottles. They're just like basically um, a shot glass size bottle with a cap on it, and they'll have a nip of walnut syrup. And if you see it on a shelf somewhere, buy it and try it because I'm telling you, it is worth it.
yeah,
It's probably going to be the same price as what you'd pay for a pint of maple, but it's like just like a walnut tree. It's gold, the gold standard.
yeah, I've had the birch syrup before. I think someone
Yeah.
brought some from Alaska, so not quite as good as maple, but
The cool thing is there's a lot of groups on social media now with sugaring people, whether they're beginners or people that have been doing it for a long time, and they're all working together, collaborating to, make a better product for themselves. And they go all the way down. I've seen some people in some of these social media groups clear down into northern Georgia, you know, and all the way up into Canada. And it's really cool seeing all those people work together to help each other make a better product for themselves.
all right. So I think that wraps us up here tonight. Thanks, Kurt, for sharing your knowledge about making maple syrup. Thanks, everyone, for attending. So this webinar has been recorded, and I'll make it available. Send out an email when it's posted, everyone. So our next in the series will be on March 5th. We've got Bob Bruner coming to talk about some native forest insects that we'll have. So it'll be pretty interesting there. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.